In this video I'm going to be addressing abortion and whether or not it should be legal and whether or not it is moral. So I'm going to start by commenting on a video by Prager University called The Most Important Question About Abortion, and though I don't agree with the video, I think it's pretty good at explaining the basic points that pro-lifers have. And by the way, as a spoiler, I am pro-choice, most of the time at least, and I'm going to explain why in this video. But so let's get started with his points in the video. First of all, I want to mention that a lot of people take this, woman's right to her own body approach to the issue. I've always seen it more as a, you should be able to do whatever you want to as long as you're not hurting anyone issue. So to me it's more about freedom to do whatever you want as long as you're not hurting anyone. But I'm not saying that the woman's right to her own body isn't an important point. I'm just saying that for most of my life that's not maybe what I've been primarily concerned about. So the question of, in this video by Prager University, he mentions, or he says that we're not going to address the question of whether it should be legal or not, but rather is it moral or not. But I think that, morality, whether it's moral or not, ties into whether it should be legal or not, since we are basing laws of morality, right? So my basic philosophy as a liberal, I guess, is that you should be able to do whatever you want as long as it's not hurting anyone. And I'm going to address the most common arguments against abortion. Some people will say that taking a life is always wrong, that killing a life is inherently wrong, and all life has inherent value. But I don't think that makes sense, because biologically speaking, a flower is a life. So is it wrong to, so to say, kill a flower? I think most people, regardless if they're pro-life or pro-choice or whatever, they will say that no, there's no moral problem with killing a flower because it's not conscious, so it's not an individual. So I think that most people do realize that it's not really a question of, it's not inherently wrong to take a life. The life has to. I think most people mean that it's wrong to kill an individual or a person. Now, there's a difference between individual and person, because an animal can be, for instance, an individual, but persons, when we're talking about persons, we're usually talking about individuals of the species Homo sapiens. There is some discussion going on what should be considered a person. The philosopher Peter Singer thinks that animals should be considered people, or at least some animals, depending on the conscious level, should be considered people. By the way, it's a bit ironic how some pro-lifers have no problem with eating meat, because, you have to admit that animals at least have more consciousness than, say, a fetus that is only a couple of weeks old. So I find it a bit hypocritical, but whatever, I'm not going to make this an entire video about veganism, so you don't have to worry about that. But I think that the important question is really, is it an individual? Not necessarily is it a person, because again, I think that individuals can have moral value without being of the species Homo sapiens, like animals have moral value, and they're individuals, but they're not persons. So is the fetus an individual is the more important question to ask. It would make more sense to say that it's inherently wrong to kill an individual than to say that it's inherently wrong to kill a life, because nobody really thinks that killing a life, a biological life, is always wrong. So my pro-choice argument is, at least for fetuses that are I think about when they're about 20 weeks, that's sort of when the consciousness starts. I may be wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but around 20 weeks, let's just say that there is some point where the consciousness starts, and before that, the fetus is not conscious and cannot be considered an individual. So my pro-choice argument is that you cannot have moral obligations towards someone that isn't an individual. that hasn't got a consciousness, and I define individual as a living being with the consciousness. So if you think that it is morally wrong to kill a living being with no consciousness, then again, as I said, is it morally wrong to destroy a flower or to cut down a tree, because it's also a living being without a consciousness, but they're not individuals. Dennis Prager goes on to address the argument about the woman's right to her own body. And he says at one point in this video, you know, people usually don't ask, how is your body doing? They ask, how is your baby doing, when they're asking about the baby. So the baby is not the woman's body. It is in her body, but it is not her body. But I think what people mean is usually that she should have the right to decide who is in her body, and yeah, basically she should be able to decide that that another being should not be in her body, basically. So that's what meant when you say that she has the right to her own body, not that the fetus necessarily is her body. Dennis Prager says that only is the argument for a woman's bodily autonomy relevant or important if we say that the fetus has no intrinsic worth at all. But I don't necessarily think that is true. It can have some low level of value, you know, maybe if it has started to have some kind of consciousness, it has some value, but not enough to override the importance of the woman's right to her own body. So in that case, yes, it can have some level of value, but the fetus's existence is not more important than the woman's right to her own body. So the woman's right overrides the fetus' rights or the fetus's value. I do think this argument makes sense, because the woman is at least like a fully conscious, developed human being, and you cannot say that for the fetus. He mentions how most of the time when the woman wants the baby, it's considered to have almost infinite worth. It's very valuable if she wants the baby, but if she doesn't want the baby, then all of a sudden the baby doesn't have any worth at all. And like how you can be prosecuted for murder if you were to kill a baby that the mother wanted to have, and which might very well be the case. And he says that this doesn't really make sense, but we're talking about like different moral concepts, I guess. So basically, I have thought about maybe making a video talking about this specific thing. I'm just going to touch on it lightly. There is something called like moral status. There's true moral status and derivative moral status. True moral status is when a being has, or an object, depending on your moral philosophy, has inherent moral value, and derivative is when it has moral value because someone who has true moral status values it. Like a book, for instance. It's wrong to destroy a book that someone has because that person cares about the book. And it's the same for the fetus. I think the fetus has derivative moral status as long as somebody cares about it, like the mother cares about it. But when nobody cares about it, if it hasn't reached the point where it has consciousness, it doesn't have any moral status whatsoever, and therefore it doesn't become wrong to basically kill it. He asks if there are instances in which even pro-choicers would say it's not okay, like if you get a female fetus, if it would be possible to see if the fetus is going to be female, which I think it might actually be, then if aborting it is wrong for that reason. So I say that if the fetus is completely unconscious, which is really what I want to dedicate this video to, and I know this is a complex topic and I may not be able to go over it completely in this video. I may make some future videos talking more about it, but anyway, if the fetus is basically unconscious, I think that it doesn't matter what the reason is. It can be the stupidest reason, it can be because it's a boy, because it's a girl, because it has the wrong hair color or skin color or whatever the hell it might be. I think that you should, again, it doesn't have any inherent moral value, so you should be able to abort it for whatever reason. However, I do question, if you want to abort someone, for instance, because they're a girl, I do question whether you're really a good enough person to be a good mother or a good father. I don't really know if I want those kinds of people to reproduce, because they're usually not the best people in the world, but I wouldn't take away their right to abort for stupid reasons. He also mentions the example, if the baby turns out to be gay, should you be able to abort? Again, if it was possible, I would think should be legal. So, but there is a conversation to be had, like, because I know you can make an abortion, you can see if a child is going to have Down syndrome, and we can have, conversations about, like, I think it should absolutely be legal, but we can have the conversations about whether it's a good idea or not. And maybe this is a topic that may need like a separate video on its own, and it sort of ties into a conversation about ableism. And for you who don't know what ableism is, it's basically valuing people, or valuing individuals, or treating them differently depending on their ability level or their disability. So for instance, you could maybe argue that it's ableist to not want a child with Down syndrome. So, but I would say that if you find out that your child is going to have it, then do your research about it and find out like as much information as you can about what it's going to be like, so you make an informed decision about whether you want the child or not. I don't know if the utilitarian argument necessarily like that it's going to experience only suffering in its life. I don't know if it's always that case. I think people with Down syndrome can be very happy, so I don't necessarily know that if that is, the morally the right thing to do from a utilitarian perspective, which by the way is of course trying to minimize pain as much as possible and maximize pleasure and happiness as much as possible. That's what utilitarianism is about, to those who don't know. But for instance, and some people will probably think I sound very transphobic when I say this, but if you could see if your child is going to be transsexual, I think maybe abortion should be the right thing to do, because from the people that I've heard from, gender dysphoria is a really difficult condition to live with. And also, like, if you're very prone to having certain mental illnesses, then maybe you could abort based on that, because then you're basically doing it out of care for that child, because you don't want that child to have to suffer that much. And after all, I don't think that life is worth anything if there's no happiness in it. That's why I'm, for instance, pro-euthanasia, or I should say I'm pro-choice. I'm not like, you have to get euthanized. I'm just, you should have that ability if you're only suffering and that's all you have left in life. He ends the video kind of by saying that, let's keep it real, most abortions are not moral, which I feel kind of the need to comment. I don't necessarily think that abortions are always moral, but I don't think they're necessarily immoral, which is, I guess, really what the conversation is about. Is it immoral or not? Because you should be allowed to do things that are not immoral, if that's what you want to do. So it might just be morally neutral. So now I talked about abortion of a fetus that is completely unconscious. But it does happen that fetuses are aborted when they're sort of starting to develop their brain and their consciousness. And I think that that's where it gets a bit more tricky, because I think that all conscious beings have some level of moral value. And I get like why you think it's wrong to kill a conscious being. I think it's wrong to kill any being with the will to be alive. That's why I'm vegan, partly because that's why I'm vegan, because I think that animals do have the want to stay alive, the interest in being alive. Now, do fetuses have that? I'm not completely sure. There's a philosopher called Peter Singer that I mentioned earlier, who thinks that even infanticide could be justified because the fetuses or the babies, the infants, aren't conscious enough to really have any moral value, or at least have more such moral value to the degree where it overrides the will of the parents. So for instance, if they don't want their newborn child, they should be able to kill it. And that is something that sort of clashes with the way I thought about morality, though I'm starting to see sort of where they're coming from. There is the point that, you know, how can you say that something has no moral value when it is inside the woman's body, and, you know, moral value when it's outside? So like, if it is okay to kill or abort a baby when it's like 9 months old, then it should be okay to kill an infant who has already been born, because they're basically at the same level of consciousness, which I do agree with. I think that if you say that it's okay to have an abortion in the ninth month, then it should also be okay to kill the child when it has already been born. Now, I'm not saying it is okay, but if you have that type of reasoning, then it's the natural conclusion is that infanticide of a born child is already a child that's already been born is also okay. Excuse me for not being able to speak properly. I'm working on it. Ben Shapiro talks in a video about how they will take like a bunch of scissors and then they will like suck out the brain and such, and I think that's quite rare, but it sounds really brutal. Maybe a more humane way in that case would be to just let the child be born and then give it some sort of maybe some sort of substance or some sort of drink. I know they have like some toxic drink that they give you in Belgium, where when they euthanize people so they die peacefully and without suffering. Maybe that would be a better idea in that case, to just let the child be born and then kill it in a more humane way, if you have to do that, of course. Again, I'm a bit skeptical to the entire idea of infanticide being okay. Peter Singer has argued for infanticide being okay when it comes to severely disabled infants, and I can say that when it comes to like infants or fetuses or whatever that might have like just a short life expectancy, that are only going to suffer until they die, and there's a very small likelihood, or maybe none at all, that they will survive for a longer period of time, then I think the most humane thing is probably to, so to say, give them euthanasia. Just like I think that it's humane to give euthanasia to people with terminal illnesses who only have suffering left in their lives. So yeah. But overall, when it comes to late-term abortions, I'm a bit torn at this point. I'm not gonna lie about it. I find it not the easiest question in the world. But there is an argument when it comes to the personal anatomy thing that I want to introduce to you, that a woman came up with. I think her name is, let's look here, Judith Jarvis Thompson. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but it's basically the violinist example. So the example is this. You wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. If he is unplugged from you now, he will die. But in 9 months he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Thompson says that you can now permissibly unplug yourself from the violinist, even though this will cause his death. This is due to limits on the right to life, which does not include the right to use another person's body, And so by unplugging the violinist, you do not violate his right to life, but merely deprive him of something, the use of your body, to which he has no right. If you do allow him to go on using your kidneys, this is a kindness on your part, and not something he can claim from you as his due. So that's something worth thinking about, I think. I'm not completely sure that I agree that the personal autonomy argument is always like valid or the most important one, but it's still worth thinking about it. Ben Shapiro asks in one of his videos on abortion, if you know that a person is brain dead, but you know they will be fully functioning again in a couple of weeks, are you justified in killing them? So I think that this is a bit different from, your average abortion, because that person is already alive, they have already developed a personality, they are already a person by that point, while as the fetus hasn't developed a personality or a consciousness or anything at all, so it has never been a person before that. But usually that person has friends and families who care about them, so for that reason it would be immoral to kill them. But let's say they don't have friends and family that value them, so I think that's still their life. If you kill them, then that's going to send a message to other people that will probably make them really anxious and uncomfortable, like if they feel like they cannot trust the system to help them when they need help, because most people want to survive, so they don't want to live with the knowledge that if I get in a coma, then I'm going to be killed. But but let's say this just happens in secrecy. Well, I still think that if they're a grown person, he took the example of a grown person, I think, then I still think that they could go on to live a good life, taking care of themselves and all of that, and not being a burden or on anyone or anything like that. And then there is of course the fact that this person is not plugged into someone else, or it's not inside of someone else's body, so it's not violating anyone's bodily autonomy. So I think overall, yes, you should let that person live, because they're not violating anyone else by living, while as the fetus would, if you continue to let it live, it would violate the mother's personal autonomy. So I think having all of these factors considered is very different. The example of the person in a coma is very different from your typical abortion. But let's say this person is plugged into someone, and that their existence might in fact be just causing pain for others, just like the fetus or the baby might do if it's born. Let's say that it's quite likely this person will have a bad life, because usually a lot of the time there is a pretty high likelihood that the child, if it's born and it's unwanted, that it will not have a good life, because the parents might not treat it as good as it would. And being alive and knowing that you're unwanted is not a really good life. So that's an important point also to make for why abortion should be legal and might be actually the moral thing to do in certain situations. So let's say this person's life is probably going to be bad. They're just a burden on others. They're plugged into someone else's body, so they're violating the bodily autonomy. They're currently unconscious. Nobody will have to maybe know about it, so it won't affect someone else's trust in the system, so to say. Is it then okay to kill that person, that fully grown man, let's say, who is in a coma? Maybe, actually. And it's still some part of me that says no, if it's already a person, then it's sort of wrong. But I think that, I think a consequentialist approach makes the most sense. And if you use that kind of approach, then, life isn't necessarily inherently valuable, just like I said before. So, yeah, it might be the right thing to do to just kill that person then, who is in a coma. But let me know what you think down below, because these are a bit tricky questions, perhaps. But finally, I would like to ask a question to all, so to say, radical pro-lifers who are like pro-life is the only right position. You should never be able to abort, not even like a 1-day-old fetus or whatever. I'm sorry if I'm a bit disorganized in my speech or whatever, but I hope you understand what my points I'm trying to get across are. But do you think that we have moral obligations towards sperms and eggs? Because some people will say if something has the potential to become a life, then we have moral obligations towards it. But in that case, you have moral obligations towards sperms and eggs. It's wrong to have menstruation, it's wrong to ejaculate, it's wrong to waste any sperms and eggs that could potentially become a person, and also you're morally obligated perhaps to have as many children as possible. So unless you make use of all the sperms and eggs you can, then you're an immoral person if you have to create a life out of everything that is a potential life, which some people seem to think. I think that doesn't really make sense, and I don't think any pro-lifer would say that you have moral obligations towards sperms and eggs. But if you don't have it, then what is the difference when that sperm and egg come together and form like this bunch of cells that are basically unconscious? I mean, why do you have moral obligations towards that thing then, when it still hasn't developed into a person? I don't know really what's the argument for that. So this is my longest video hitherto. I hope that I made my points clear, because I'm a bit uncertain. My brain is a bit disorganized, so sometimes I'm just rambling and it doesn't really become coherent. But I've been thinking about making this for a while, but I used to have like just a pro-choice stance. I just call myself pro-choice, and that's basically, I mean, of course you're pro-choice, why would you not be? What's my philosophy? You know, you're not hurting anyone, so what's the problem? But then I realized that it is a bit more complex than that, and there are legitimate discussions to be had about like the gray areas. As I mentioned, like late-term abortion, I'm not completely sure what I think about that yet. So it's a complex topic, and I avoided talking about it a bit because I feel like, again, there's a bit of uncertainty, and I wasn't sure I was going to make this video, you know, a good video. But I hope that you get pretty much what my position is on this issue, and that I made sense and that everything is coherent and so on. Finally, I would just like to mention a point that some people, especially feminists, bring up, and that is that men should not talk about it because they cannot be pregnant. And while I think that some men definitely would change their mind if it like personally affected them, like they could become pregnant, I really don't like that kind of, like, you belong to group X, so you shouldn't talk about this, because ultimately it's a philosophical conversation, it's a scientific conversation, it's an exchange of ideas basically. So everyone should be able to participate. And you know, if you're solely going to say that, you know, men don't have a say at all, like what if you have a debate between a pro-life woman and a pro-choice man? Would you still disregard the man's position, or would you say that, well, it depends on what their argument is? So I think that focus on the arguments when you're having discussions, and don't just attack someone for being a man and having a certain opinion. Instead, just explain why you think is wrong. Some people will say that this is like a feminist issue, which maybe it is. I mean, if you think feminism is strictly about equality, I mean, it's not an equality issue since men don't get pregnant, well, unless they're trans, I guess. So it's more like a women's issue only. And I don't think that you have to hate women or be against women or be against equality even to be pro-life. So I don't like that kind of mentality where people like say that, oh, you hate women or you're against women or something if you're pro-life. So yeah, basically don't use ad hominems, I guess, don't smear people and so on when you're having these conversations. So now this video is almost or about half an hour long, and I'm going to end it now. I'm going to watch the debate also with Rachel Oates and Cosmic Skeptic and Rationality Rules, and see if my position change. It's a debate about abortion, and see if my position changes when I watch that. But this is what I think currently, and yeah, you can put your comments down below as usual, and please, if you can, like, give me tips on how to improve my argumentation or whatever, because I feel like this video I didn't make my point very clear, and I feel like I'm always making excuses, but my first language is not English. I'm not very used to speaking in English, but I hope I made sense. I hope you understand what I'm getting at. But if you have any tips on how to improve my communication, my expression of my ideas, how to put it into words better, then please message me or write it in the comments. So there's probably a lot more to be said about this, more than you can fit in even a half an hour long video, but this is what I have to say right now, and I might come back to the topic later when I thought about it some more. As usual, subscribe and hit the bell so that you don't miss my videos. If you don't hit the bell, it might just get lost, but if you hit the bell, you're going to get a notification when I upload a new video. So yeah, do that and have a great day.